Welcome to C-SPAN Book TV's After Words program. My name's Christopher Hitchens, and I'm here in the, for me, unaccustomed role of interviewer and producer of my friend and colleague George Packer, who's produced 2 volumes of the essays of George Orwell, appropriately picked and introduced and commented upon. And so today, Orwell is our subject. So I wish we had more than an hour. I'm guessing that you will have read D.J. Taylor's book on George Orwell.
I haven't.
Oh, what a shame. But it doesn't matter, because what I wanted to say from his book was something that I have a feeling you'll agree with. Taylor writes at one point, says, when I read other people writing about George Orwell, I keep thinking, hey, this is my author you're talking about. Do you ever get that feeling?
I do, and we all have you and I and a few other people we know and some we don't know are part of a really fanatical group of Orwell lovers, and it's very personal. And I started reading Orwell maybe a little late. It was in my early 20s, but it was at a critical moment when I needed a kind of a model. I needed to know, how does one become a writer? And so I just read straight through what was then the only collection of Orwell's essays in journalism, the 4 volumes, collected essays, journalism, and letters, and just read straight through. It was like reading an autobiography. And
you felt yourself being personally addressed? I
felt very close to the voice of those pieces, and I think those are where you get closest to Orwell, to his voice, to what's essential, to his, really what in his character is strong and worth emulating. And I became a slavish emulator and imitator for a while in my 20s. I think it's a good way to learn how to write, just to find a writer you feel some affinity for and just master their prose style, their rhythms. You get the cadences into your own nerve system, and then try to find your own way into it. But that's the closeness Orwell produces in people like me and you. And so, yeah, we feel a little bit proprietary when we read other people writing about him too, but not when those people get him right. And I think your book, Why Orwell Matters, gets him right. You said in that book, Orwell got the 3 basic questions of the 20th century right: imperialism, fascism, and communism. And that sums up his political and literary achievement as well as any single appraisal.
I always feel they derived from each other. In other words, from what he saw about imperialism, especially the sort of sexual repression and racism that it involved, I think he found it quite easy to decode the appeal of fascism and the danger of it. It was to some extent an extension of imperialism, not purely, but to a good deal.
Yeah.
To a good deal. In many ways that was the case. And then, because it's funny, he hardly writes anything about fascism. He seems to just assume everyone will know that it's evil and needs to be fought against.
That's right.
There's almost nothing strange. There's almost no analysis of it. He takes it for granted that it's completely unacceptable, but it's in the course of fighting against one kind of totalitarianism that he discovers that there are many people claiming to be his allies who are not.
Yes.
And that actually there's an almost equally dangerous illusion taking place on the other side of the Urals.
That's right, and he turned the same withering scrutiny on his own side that he had turned on a much easier target: Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Franco's Spain. And that was when he made most of his enemies on the left, and all the way to the end of his life. Yeah.
Now, I realize I haven't said quite enough about you. I should perhaps have said some of this at the beginning, but for those of you who don't know him already or know his work, Mr. Packer, well, first came to my attention actually as a novelist, writing from Africa, in fact, and like Orwell, was capable of fiction, very enviably, as well as of the long essay form by which I would think you're now probably reaching a larger audience. Mr. Packer's work, especially from Iraq, and other parts of the world, but especially from Iraq, in the New Yorker, has got him a great deal of attention, and I believe you now have a collection of essays of your own.
I do. A new book out called Interesting Times, Writings from a Turbulent Decade. But back to fiction.
Yes.
You probably overpraised me there. I did write 2 novels. They were read by about 35 people, and although I learned a lot from writing them, I did not learn to be a novelist, I don't think. Orwell wrote a batch of novels in the 1930s that were in the tradition of Anglo-American realism, and I love them. I don't know how you feel about them, but for me, Keep the Aspidistra Flying is just a marvelous book. Burmese Days is the one that really lasts the longest, but you just don't feel that Orwell's working in his most natural grain in those novels. You feel the essayist sort of pushing through the illusion of fiction all the time. He has something to say. He has an argument to make. He has something, a proposition about the world all the time. And he doesn't have the restraint and patience of a natural fiction writer. And that's why we can be grateful that, he once wrote in, I think in Why I Write, that if he'd been left to his own devices, he would have been a kind of 19th century British novelist like his heroes Dickens and Gissing. But events and the turbulence of the 30s and 40s pushed him into becoming what he called a kind of pamphleteer. Yeah. And
by the way, I have to interrupt, because it's one of the very few completely unconvincing things I think he ever wrote.
Absolutely. I was just going to say that, because really it was not events that pushed him in that direction. It was his own inclination.
Yes. Also, it's a very rare case of him being too conceited. In other words, he said, if it wasn't for all these polemics I have to write, I could have been Charles Dickens. Well, come on, I mean, that's a bit much. The Burmese say, there's a saying in Burma, that he flattered them by writing 3 novels about their country. Burmese Days, Animal Farm, and 1984.
Right. I actually heard that line in Burma last year when I went there.
Did you?
Oh, yes, Orwell is still a huge presence in Burma. All the more, I think now, there's a young generation who did not learn English well growing up. They came after the generation that was schooled by the British. They've had their futures utterly blighted by the totalitarian regime there. And Orwell speaks to them not just because he wrote about Burma, but as you say, because he wrote about totalitarianism. 1984 has so many echoes in Burma today, and so you can actually find Animal Farm being sold discreetly in bookstalls on the streets of Rangoon. And so he's he's reemerged as a hero to these younger Burmese writers after being condemned for his supposed imperialism by the junta.
And while we're on contemporary totalitarianism, which we might as well stay with for a bit, I've been in North Korea, and when one goes as a reporter, one hopes to avoid cliché. And so I thought, I'm going to try not to mention 1984. Because everyone says it's an Orwellian state. It's a funny use of the word Orwellian.
Yeah.
But in fact, the great thing about totalitarianism is that it is a cliché.
It seems to do the same thing over and over again.
Kim Il-sung founded the North Korean state the same year that 1984 came out, I think. And it's as if someone gave him the novel in Korean and said, do you think we could make this work? And he thinks, well, I don't know, but we'll sure give it our best shot. It's absolutely remarkable.
Life imitated art.
Yes, and it's the same. When people in countries like this come across Orwell, as the North Koreans one day will, they're amazed. I think the greatest compliment perhaps ever paid to one writer by another in the 20th century was by Czesław Miłosz, when he, in The Captive Mind, when he wrote about the situation in Stalinist Poland. He said, there is a book in circulation, it's called 1984, you can only get it privately. It's circulated with great secrecy and fear among the inner party. And he said, I personally was very surprised, as we all were, to find out he'd never visited the Soviet Union, because how could he get the texture? How could he get the texture of it all so right without having had this experience? Now, remember, 1984 is about the circulation of an illegal book within the inner party, among other things.
Goldstein.
So it's extraordinary.
But that is a great question. How did Orwell know? He lived almost his entire life in England. He traveled a bit through Europe at the end of World War II. He had his years in Burma. But other than that, he was very parochial. He was confined to the island. And yet he wrote in his essay on Arthur Koestler that the British writers of his generation had failed to understand totalitarianism because they had not lived it the way Koestler, Salone, Camus, and other continental writers had. And so he was sort of criticizing the, what he called the parlor Bolsheviks, Auden, Spender, etc., for not feeling what it is to live under that kind of regime. Orwell felt it, but he had the same, other than his years in Burma and his suffering and hard times in the 30s, which they did not have. He had the same education and lived in the same England that they did, and yet he did feel it. And it's a bit of a mystery how he could have known it so well.
Well, I think I have a possible solution, and also a slight correction to you. In reverse order, then, or correction first. Not as insular as all that. After all, he did spend a lot of time in the Far East, admittedly as a colonial policeman.
Yeah.
But I think being a colonial cop gave him an insight into the master-servant, indeed almost master-slave relationship. Very useful in describing some of the, again, dirty secret sexual underlay of totalitarianism. Then he was in Spain, and he was in Barcelona at a time when the Communist Party did briefly take over, and there was a police terror.
That's right.
And third, very important, he noticed that all the truth about Spain had been written out of the record. And he wrote, in looking back on the Spanish War, he was really afraid that this was becoming a habit now in Europe, that if the leader says something never happened, then it never did. And you can see the germ of 1984
done
coming.
Partly by the father of your old nation colleague, Claude Cockburn, father of Alexander Cockburn.
Yes, and by, not just by communists. I mean, quite a lot of other people fell for the line that the Communist Party was the best defender of the Spanish Republic. And it's only very recently that the archives of both Franco's system and the Stalinist system have been opened, and we do know what happened in those May days in Barcelona. And actually what Orwell said was happening was in every detail true.
Yeah.
He refused the lie. But then the second point I want to make is about going on with his insularity, is his first real book is written in French, Down and Out in Paris and London. It was originally a French book. He spoke very good French. He spoke at least 2 Indian and Burmese languages.
Well, it wasn't written in French. He wrote the essays in it, the sketches in English. He wrote a couple of little essays for a small French publication called Le Progrès Civique, back when he was in Paris.
Including a long essay on colonialism in Burma.
That's right, that's right. And then wrote the manuscript of Down and Out, which which was rejected by T.S. Eliot and some of the other major...
Did Eliot reject Down and Out in Paris and London?
No, it was rejected by... yeah, I think it was Eliot. He was at Faber in 1931 or 32 and rejected it, and then rejected Animal Farm many years later. So he and Orwell had
as did
connection.
Harcourt and Brace in America. One of the best rejection letters I think ever written. Every aspiring writer should have this rejection letter pasted in their hat to consult. It says, "Dear Mr. Orwell, thank you for letting us look at your manuscript, Animal Farm. Unfortunately, it's impossible to sell stories about animals in the United States."
That's right.
So in the country of Disney, they could make such a fatuous remark, and they really thought it was a story about the farmyard.
And then Animal Farm became a very good cartoon film. So it is. They were wrong about that too.
Commissioned by the CIA.
Yeah, but just to get back to the experience of reading Orwell and the essays in this book. When I started reading him, and I don't know if you had this experience, I didn't know much about fascism or communism or imperialism. I was looking more for an example of how a writer carried himself in the world and how to transform experience into sentences, and how to do it in a way that didn't call more attention to the self than to the experience. And again in Why I Write, Orwell wrote, "Good prose is like a window pane." Another maybe dubious claim, but helpful in the sense that his words are always pointing to the thing and not back to the self. And they reveal so much about a character. I mean, there's something almost, you feel you know him when you read his essays. You feel you know how he speaks, you can hear his voice, you know his irritations, you know how he's going to react if you say something. He's almost alive with you, even though there's also a certain remoteness to Orwell. He doesn't let you in on everything in his life. He doesn't talk about his marriage very much in his writing. He doesn't talk about his child, Richard Orwell. He doesn't talk about his parents. Some of the basic things that American memoirists make, gold out of, that are the subjects of book after book, for Orwell were kind of off limits. He was a bit constrained, maybe by late Victorian shibboleths that way. But nonetheless, you have this very strong sense of the person behind the words, and that was what first drew me to him and makes those essays, worth reading over and over again.
I should perhaps have done this by now, but just for those of you watching us, this is George's first selection. It's called All Art is Propaganda, and it's about Orwell's essays. And then another one called Facing Unpleasant Facts, which is his more polemical stuff, we might say. I've comment on both the titles, by the way.
Yeah.
When Orwell writes about himself, he says, well, when I got started, all I knew I had was a little literary ability and a power of facing unpleasant facts. I remember thinking, a power of facing is very good. I wanted to call my book that for a while. It's something almost biblical about it.
Yeah. It's an unusual phrase, isn't it? A power of facing, as if it's an active force. It gives you some advantage, which is true. He was able to look at things, at times almost exaggerated the ugliness or the bad smells, or seemed to seek them out with a kind of relish, but nonetheless, things in himself, in England, in democracy, in literature.
In the working class.
And in the working class, which the famous line from his great book about coal mining and coal miners, The Road to Wigan Pier, the working class's smell, which Orwell said isn't necessarily true, but it's what middle and upper class people think, and it's the reason why the class divide is such a hard thing to overcome in Britain, because it's almost physical. It's not just kind of mental snobbery. And I think that line, am I right, that line really bothered Victor Gollancz, who was the publisher of the book.
The communist went on for the rest of his life saying that this is what Orwell thinks about the working class.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they smeared him with it. But he doesn't romanticize when he's among the workers, though he's on their side. He doesn't romanticize them at all, nor does he romanticize the colonial subjects, on whose side he also is.
That's right.
Because he often finds them repulsive.
Absolutely. The opening lines of Shooting an Elephant, which to me is almost, it's the perfect Orwell essay, where you just see his mastery of the form at its best. And I use it to teach the essay a lot, because students just see how he does it so clearly. But at the beginning he says, with one part of my mind I hated British imperialism, with another part I thought the greatest pleasure would be to stab my bayonet into a Buddhist priest's guts. And that's a kind of confession about himself and about the Burmese that may be painful personally, but from a literary point of view, is very powerful, because it invites the reader in. It says, I have all sorts of conflicting feelings, and I'm going to own up to them and even make them the subject of this essay.
Another thing, you mentioned his reticence. About which he never says anything. He never tells us why he resigned from the Burmese police.
That's right.
But my guess is that he was afraid if he carried on with it, he would become a sadist.
He had a streak of that in him.
Yeah.
He wrote once that to understand fascism, you have to have a streak of fascism. He was talking about Jack London, whose book, The Iron Heel, was a kind of prophecy of fascism, but he might as well have been talking about himself, too. And that, too, I think, is an answer to that question we were talking about earlier. How could Orwell have understood what was happening behind the veil of terror of Stalinist Russia, Nazi Germany, without direct personal experience of it, except, as you pointed out, in Barcelona? And I think it's partly because he had the sterner stuff in him than some of his British
well, you very correctly
compeers.
say in your introduction that most of his arguments were with himself. I thought that was very well encapsulated, because a lot of people are, if you like, naturally liberals or naturally progressives. They think it's just, a nice way to be. And he absolutely didn't think like that at all, had scorn for those who did. And I think what's fascinating is he's someone educating himself out of an upbringing where he'd been taught to look down on and rather fear the lower orders, to look on colored people in the empire as raw material, to be very suspicious of Jews, which clearly took him a long time to get over that. Has to reason his way out of that.
That's right. Your book makes that clear. Yeah.
Sorry, do excuse me, get carried away with my own verbosity. And And then one very, very enduring prejudice, which he doesn't cure himself of, is absolute hatred and disgust for homosexuality.
That's right. He used that phrase, the pansy left, to talk about Auden and Spender, and yeah, it was not the nicest side of him. And there are women who think that he was a terrible misogynist, and even that his misogyny, his inability to create convincing female characters, for example, Julia in 1984 is not the most persuasive part of that novel, but that was part of why he ended with such a dark vision of the world. This is the subject of a book by, I think her name is Daphne Patai, The Orwell Mystique. I don't think it's right. I think that's giving totalitarianism not enough credit for being the darkness that was surrounding Europe at the end of Orwell's life. But it's true that he has a strange attitude, you might almost say, toward individuals. Unlike a journalist today, he doesn't spend a lot of time on characters in his nonfiction. You never get to know any coal miner by name. You don't get to know anyone in his outfit in the militia in Barcelona particularly well. You learn a few of their names. Sometimes he just recites them almost like an honor roll, but you don't get to the inside of their being.
No, but there's the poem about the soldier he meets.
Yeah.
And sort of feels a comradeship with the first handshake.
With the Italian militiaman in Barcelona.
Very nice.
And that's a beautiful moment at the beginning of Homage to Catalonia. And then at the end of the poem that concludes that essay looking back on the Spanish War. But he also says, I didn't want to meet him again because if I did, it would ruin my first impression, which is that this is sort of the flower of the European working class. And that, I think, is the way his mind always goes, away from the individual and toward the social type, toward the political and social significance of digging coal underground.
Also, I think, to preserve his own distance, you see. I mean, there's one point he replies to someone who asks him if he'd like to come to dinner and meet Stephen Spender, then famous poet of the period, and he says no, because I think I may want to write about him, and I find it much harder, and I think what I'm going to say is going to be pretty disobliging. I find it much harder to do that once I've met someone.
That's right.
It's sort of both very human and also very inhuman. It's saying, I don't sort of trust myself to be intimate.
Because he knows that, as he wrote in the essay on Gandhi, being human means attaching yourself to other human beings and being willing to be broken down and even destroyed by your love for this individual. That essay is quite harsh about Gandhi's impersonal love for all of humanity and his cruelty or neglect of his own family. For Orwell, this was a perverse inversion of the proper order of things, which is you love the individual, not mankind. He was not a saint. He was not a lover of mankind in that sort of Gandhian way, although he's been sanctified by some people posthumously. So it's absolutely true that that's where his feelings drive him, but there's also a counterforce that cuts him off from those attachments, and I think it may partly be simply because they get in the way of writing, and writing honestly. And so the individuals are missing, strangely missing from his books.
By the way, is a good illustration of another point you make, which is Orwell's ability to start with a very arresting opening sentence. And the one on Gandhi, as I know you know, begins by saying, well, all saints should be considered guilty until proven innocent.
We could just swap Orwell openers here. No autobiography should be trusted unless it reveals something disgraceful, which is the beginning of his essay on Dali. In Moulmein and Lower Burma, I was hated by large numbers of people. The only time in my life I've been important enough for this to happen to me, shooting an elephant.
Very good.
Yes.
But I think with the Gandhi intro as well, it shows something else, which is his general distaste for the spiritual. I think he always thought there was something shady or creepy about that. And his general contempt for religion, though he had a respect for it too. I mean, he obviously knows the Bible very well. He quotes from it a lot, clearly from memory, almost always word perfect, or as good as. That's how I know it's from memory.
There's at key moments, his marriage to Eileen O'Shaughnessy, he insisted on having it done in a Church of England ceremony. He was buried in a Church of England graveyard.
He liked the liturgy very much.
You feel it's a kind of cultural attachment to the words, the cadences, and the traditions of the Church of England, which has absolutely nothing to do with heaven, which he described somewhere as, in the vulgar version, seeming like a choir practice in a jeweler's shop. So yeah, he was not a religious man. There's no sign anywhere of a belief in the afterlife.
But I think he had a strong feeling for the Protestant Revolution, however. I mean, it shows in his attachment to Milton, who was the great bard of that. In fact, his favorite line was a line of Milton's, which was, "By the known rules of ancient liberty." In other words, there is a human instinct for freedom. And he writes about the Protestant centuries, as he puts it, in a positive way, contributing to the European Enlightenment. And I think, back to 1984 again, the struggle against an alien language that's been imposed upon people, that of Newspeak, and the struggle to find out what is in the secret book that only the party has, is a very good analogy to the struggle of Wycliffe and Coverdale and Tyndale to have the Bible translated into English, for which they were all martyred. And I think the English Revolution was important to him.
I think there's an essay called The Prevention of Literature, which is about the effect of not just totalitarian countries, but the internal censorship that came with the totalitarianization of British intellectuals. And that essay begins, the effect on literature, the effect on books. He says, books like Some Wild Animals can't breed in captivity. It kills the imagination. And that essay begins with a sort of a scene from a gathering of PEN, the writers' organization that Orwell attended. It's an unusual case in which he actually places himself at some sort of public meeting as a jumping off point for the essay. And at this PEN meeting, no one is able to stand up and defend free expression. Everyone is defending the right of the Soviet Union to do this, or it reminds me kind of the worst of sort of identity politics when it invaded writers' organizations in this country in the 80s and 90s. So suddenly the last thing anyone wants to speak up for is free expression. I think a good example, which is very near to your heart, is when Salman Rushdie came under the fatwa from the Iranian government, and there was hardly any writer who was able to say this is an absolute atrocity, except you did.
Oh, that's too kind to me. I mean, there were a lot of people who did very well. I remember Susan Sontag actually convened a very good meeting.
That's true. I think you were among the very first. But back to Orwell, that essay then continues to imagine, what if Milton were to come back today and attend this PEN meeting? He'd be astonished. And no one at the meeting in 1945 or 6 was able to defend free expression with the unqualified force of Milton 300 years earlier. So I think you're absolutely right that that period was a kind of a touchstone for him in the struggle for
To the title of your other volume, where you say all art is propaganda, I have a question to ask you. I know that he wrote that in wartime, as he wrote in 1941, in wartime all writing is now propaganda.
Yeah.
It's in an attack, I think, on Alex Comfort and his pacifism in the face of Hitler.
That's right. Where does this come from?
Yes.
He says it in several places. He says it, for example, in his essay on Dickens. And
does he? I'd forgotten.
He does. But what he means by it, and he says it also, I think...
Also begins very brilliantly. Dickens is one of those authors who's well worth stealing.
There you go. I knew we could have a little ping-pong game of
showing off
opening liners. No, it's fun. I think he might say it in another essay called The Meaning of a Poem. For him it means, and the reason I gave the book this title, not that all art could have been written by the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, or even the Ministry of Information in wartime England, but that all art implicitly has a point of view. It has something to say about the world, and as he says, it's trying to push one's view in a certain direction. It has a persuasive function. It has a if it's worth anything, it has a kind of a worldview that it is advocating. And I think it's not a resignation to the crudeness of wartime propaganda. It's more his sort of smoking out the art for art's sake crowd who would like to have art be separate from the world of ideas and politics and events. And he's saying, especially in a time like the 40s,
yes,
it was impossible to be a serious artist and not have something to say about events, even if you're writing very internal
Well, he makes that
poems.
confession for himself and says every line I've ever written in the last 20 years that's anyway, on any serious topic or any serious line is written with the hope of forwarding the cause of democratic socialism.
Democratic socialism is the phrase he uses, and against totalitarianism. I mean, not every writer is going to be as explicitly political as Orwell, nor do we want them to be, but I think it's his technique as a literary critic, and as a critic of a field he practically invented, which is popular cultural criticism, to find the implied or hidden worldview in what seems to be a kind of benign or not particularly pointed realm of art or culture, like the postcards of sort of the Donald McGill postcards that are sort of semi-pornographic or at least mildly risque that were sold in England at that time.
So monotonously indecent.
That's a great phrase for it. Or the boys' weeklies,
yes.
Or the detective novels in his essay Raffles and Miss Blandish. He's always, that essay is a good example. What are you going to do with an essay that basically compares two different eras in British detective fiction, Raffles from the turn of the century and a novel called No Orchids for Miss Blandish, which apparently was rather popular around 1943. And the point he comes to is there's a shift in moral point of view between these two. Raffles has a code which is not a particularly lovable code. It's the code of a hypocritical English gentleman, but nonetheless it's a code, and so there's certain things that can't be done. Whereas No Orchids for Miss Blandish, the only code is power and the pursuit of it, and that's what should be admired. And there's a great passage in that essay where he says people appreciate power at the level at which they can understand it. And he has a boy in a Glasgow slum worships Jack Dempsey. A student at a business college worships Lord somebody or other. A reader of the New Statesman worships Stalin. It's a difference in intellectual level, but not in moral outlook. And that's how he finds sort of I'd say the moral implications of something that seems as trivial as detective fiction.
I'm so glad you bring this up because it brings me quicker than I wanted to, but let's do it now. It's just something I wanted to raise. A lot of his writing about ethical codes and reticence and discretion, so versus ruthlessness and the cult of violence, reflect hostility to the United States.
Yeah.
Say that, look at the comics that British boys read, now look at the American ones that are coming in that are full of sadism and gangsterism and so forth.
Exactly.
So we began by saying, or you began by saying of my book that I said he got 3 great questions of the 20th century right.
Yeah.
But I add that he got on one of them, I think, not totally wrong, but the importance of America was something that he didn't write enough about, and when he did, it was rather sketchy and often rather condescending.
You have a chapter on Orwell and America, which he never visited. Right. He loved some American writers, Mark Twain, Jack London, Henry Miller, oddly enough. But I think for Orwell, America was...
Thomas Paine.
Thomas Paine, absolutely, British-born. But I think for Orwell, America was... it didn't have the things that he was attached to, and that are the things Winston Smith in 1984 is clinging to for sanity, the odd traditions, the things passed on from one generation to another, like the lyrics of a nursery rhyme or a song, old books and bookstores that trade in old books. Of course, some of these things are available here. He wouldn't have known that.
Little country churches with brass rubbings.
You got it. Yeah. The yew tree in the country churchyard. Yes. For Orwell, those things were sort of the bulwark against the monolithic paving over of everything by not just totalitarianism, but by modern life. I mean, he hated concrete, he hated central heating, he hated
Yes. Advertising.
Most mechanical entertainment. He hated advertising, and all these things seem to be coming not just from the East in the Soviet Union, but from the West in the United States.
Yes.
And his, in this sense, there was something parochial about.
On the other hand, he did dislike anti-Americanism very much.
Yes, that's right.
Which was then beginning to become a disease on the left.
Because I think he understood it to be a kind of anti-liberalism and a refuge of a particular kind of snobbery that you find on the left, which sees America as the vulgarization of all good things. It's connected, I think, to the conservative version.
Cowboyism.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I think the point you made in your book and you're making now is absolutely right. He didn't see America as a guarantor of the things that he cared most about. Culturally especially, it was an alien and distasteful place to him.
It's a pity that he died when he did, because his friends at Partisan Review, knowing he was unwell with TB, tried to get him to come to US, firstly for treatment.
Really? I didn't know that.
Because streptomycin was easy to get in America, very hard to get. But he died of poverty, in fact. He died of an almost Dickensian death.
Yeah.
And they said, come over, and you'll like it. And he would have been a great addition to the Partisan Review crowd. And at one point, he contemplated making a voyage down the Mississippi.
Which is what he would have done. It does.
It'd be
that
nice
would have
to
been
have Orwell going down
after
the Mississippi.
After 1984, his next book would have been about the Mississippi.
Now,
yeah.
I've got something for you on the American. This is very suggestive. It's slight, but I think you might like it. You will have no difficulty in telling me what the opening sentence of 1984 is.
The clocks were striking 13.
It was a bright,
cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Yeah, that's right.
I was reading John Adams the other day, and he was writing about how to get the colonies together and how to coordinate a revolution against British power. And he says it'll be very difficult to get all 13 clocks to strike at the same time.
There you go.
And then at the end of the book, in the Dictionary of Newspeak, at the end of 1984, he shows how the attempt is made to obliterate all the possibility even of thinking about freedom from the language, and just to make it impossible even to formulate the thought. And he gives an example of a sentence that couldn't be translated into Newspeak. And it is, we hold these truths to be self-evident.
That's great.
And the following is saying. So there's a possible one, and certainly, a possible two, and certainly one implied compliments to America in that.
But just imagine Orwell traveling through early 50s America, the America of Lolita, the America of the Eisenhower years, when the suburbanization of the country was happening, the highway system was being put in place, intellectuals were beginning to leave Partisan Review, leave Greenwich Village, and take some comfort and security in universities. It's almost unimaginable. It's like a whole different era had begun by that time, and Orwell, to me, belongs so completely to a previous era that was harder, more exacting, more austere, and all the abundance and comfort of post-war America would have left him pretty cold. Although you're right, he would have found places to love. I think the Mississippi is one, maybe the West with its landscape.
I would have thought New York too.
I
Probably not San Francisco.
He didn't love London. I mean, he lived in London and he worked in London. He even made a point of staying in London during the Blitz when other people were leaving.
Yes.
But once London was no longer at risk, its charms for him wore off, which tells you something about the way in which he actually pursued hard experience actively rather than simply not avoiding it. And so instead, he moved to one of the hardest places in the British Isles, the Isle of Jura, off the coast of Scotland, where he lived his last years, probably hastened his death and wrote 1984. But I don't know if you saw this, his son, Richard Orwell, his adopted son, had kind of maintained his silence for 60 years. And we only knew he existed. We didn't know anything about him. And he gave an interview about a year ago. He's, I think, an agricultural engineer somewhere in England, which is kind of what you'd expect. And he describes being Orwell's son in those years in Jura. And far from being this gloomy, apocalyptic, Jeremiah of totalitarianism, Orwell was just a lot of fun. He took him fishing, he took him boating, they went on all these adventures, they nearly got killed a bunch of times. It wasn't physically easy, but Orwell was completely attuned to the natural world and to his son, and shared his love of physical things and of nature with Richard. And it's, for me, gives me a lot of pleasure to know that Orwell was a good father.
I don't find that surprising at all, because first, he had a very bleak childhood himself. And obviously didn't like his father.
Yeah.
In fact, when he mentions the analogy of a family for British society, it has every figure in it except a daddy, which is a kind of strange omission.
Right, a family with the wrong people in charge.
But he mentions maiden aunts and distant cousins and rich poor, but no father.
That's right.
Second, though, it's very rare to find a joke in George Orwell. That when they do occur, they're quite funny. They're very dry. I'm trying to think of one. Well, in Animal Farm, when the animals take over, one of the things they do is go into the smokehouse and take out the hams and give them a decent burial. I thought that was quite funny.
Exactly.
And his essay on Confessions of a Book Reviewer is extremely funny.
Yes, the picture of the book reviewer.
But generally, it's pretty bleak. How do you come out on the question of Lionel Trilling, who says of Orwell that the great thing about him is he's not a genius? That the extraordinary thing is how someone so relatively ordinary could, just by refusing to lie and working very hard and not caring whether he lost a job or got his book published or was able to change the 20th century.
In other words, qualities of character alone are sufficient to become a great writer and to become one of the most important writers of the century. Yes and no. Part of what drew me to Orwell back in my 20s was this sense that this is available. This is not the mad brilliance of Saul Bellow. This is not Faulkner's, arabesques. This is not. This isn't even Hemingway's, highly self-conscious, stylized prose. It felt like natural prose. I mean, that is a conceit, because
it doesn't make you feel as you do when you're reading Nabokov, for example. Why do I bother?
Why do I? Impossible. I can admire, but I also, can feel sort of discouraged by it. No, with Orwell, you feel encouraged by it. You want to go do it yourself. That's the feeling that he gives me. You want to try to write an essay like that. Because the prose is simple. It has the plain style, and it seems like the leading characteristic of it is honesty, which one ought to be capable of. On the other hand, I think Trilling might go a little too far, just in the sense that decency alone, I think the word he uses about Orwell, is not, it's a key Orwell word, common decency, and it's an important one, but Orwell was an eccentric. Orwell was a difficult man. He had his full of contradictions. He was not so simple and good, I think, as Trilling would have you think. And you alluded earlier to some of his antipathies, and he was a man of violent dislikes. And in some of his earlier work, before I think he calmed down with a certain amount of self-assurance, denunciation was his characteristic mode. Yeah. So he's certainly not a saint, and he's not simply a good man whose qualities of character allowed him to write great books. But there's enough truth to that he is sort of a model available to everyone, who's writing.
It's very difficult to imagine him being afraid, say.
Yeah, exactly. Or if he was afraid, whether physically or morally, he then would have noted it and forced himself to overcome it.
The power of facing.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we've only got about 10 more minutes, and what I thought I would do is take up the idea of Dickens being a writer worth stealing, as Orwell called him, and talk about attempts to appropriate Orwell.
Yeah.
The other meaning of Orwellian, but it's not usually used to describe a totalitarian state, is in some sense someone who stands for a certain set of principles.
That's the use I like. It's the positive use of it.
And he's often invoked. I mean, he was invoked against his will somewhat in the early days of the Cold War, which are the only ones he saw, by people who thought that Animal Farm in 1984 was specifically attacks on socialism, which he didn't want.
That's right. And he had to actually write a statement saying, I'm a supporter of the Labour Party.
Yes.
And Ingsoc is not an indictment of English socialism. It's a warning about the tendency of all modern political thought to move toward totalitarianism.
Also, by the way, he added, and he was very affirmative of the English, it was to show that the English were no better than anybody else.
That's right. That's right.
Well, the best way we could take this on the chin, you and I, since at different times we both viewed with favor the removal of Saddam Hussein from power.
Yeah.
And I think Orwell was in our minds at different times, and certainly I know of other people who sort of tried. Is it worth asking, do you think, what would Orwell have thought?
But just to finish the little history you started, he was also claimed by Norman Podhoretz of Commentary in an essay called "If Orwell Had Lived." Basically, if Orwell had lived, he would have been a neocon. He would have been a neocon. He would have been Norman Podhoretz.
Well, on that I feel I can pronounce, because Podhoretz thought that Orwell would have taken the American side in Indochina. And I think I could be certain that that's not so.
Because of his anti-imperialism.
Because he was very strongly anti-colonial, especially in that part of Asia, which he knew certainly about. And he actually mentions, when he's in Paris at the end of the war, the revival of a sort of left opposition type anti-Stalinist paper. And one of the great essays that it's printed, which is about the attempt to restore French colonialism in Indochina, which is the ancestor of the American intervention.
Exactly.
I think he would have regarded it
he would have seen it as a colonial war.
As a continuity.
And for that reason, he would have been, I think you're absolutely right.
I think we have some
Iraq is different.
Yeah, we don't have the same authority.
It's not a colonial war. You know, there's, in a way, it's very hard to say, and it's a little dangerous to claim, but we can speculate because we have to. There's two different arguments to be made about that. One is that Orwell would have seen in Saddam's rule, other than perhaps North Korea, the nearest thing to the world he imagined in 1984. I mean, you say that totalitarianism is a cliche. Iraq is a great example. Saddam was Big Brother. He had Big Brother's mustache. His face was on posters all over Baghdad. It was on television all the time. You could not escape the eye of Saddam's many secret police.
Iraqis used to say they thought he knew what they were dreaming.
Exactly, and that he was inside them, and that even after he was overthrown, they felt they continued to suffer from the effects of decades.
No, well, we both saw it in action, and it was the pornographic element of power has probably never been more horribly.
I mean, Saddam's son was sort of the human incarnation of the pornography of totalitarianism, with rape and all kinds of crimes. So that one is easy to say, that Orwell would have seen that regime as it was. There would have been no defenses of sovereignty or state sovereignty, or of that this somehow is an anti-Islamic war, or that this is an anti-Arab war. He would have seen that regime as a modern, secular, totalitarian regime, which is what it was. On the other hand,
I would say not so secular. And Saddam Hussein, who put Allahu Akbar on the Iraqi flag and has himself
toward the end he used Sunni Islam for his purposes. That's right. The other side of it is the language used by the Bush administration, both before the war and after the invasion, which in many ways was mendacious, was euphemistic, was misleading, was bad language. It was the kind of bad language that allows bad political thought, which is the subject of Politics and the English Language, maybe the best known of Orwell's essays. And I think Orwell would have been merciless in stripping away the rhetoric of George Bush, Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, and Karl Rove, for that matter. And so which Orwell would have had the vote? The anti-totalitarian Orwell, who would have seen Iraq exactly as it was and known that to stand up against Saddam was to stand up for the Kurds, to stand up for masses of Iraqis who did not want to continue this way. And he would have understood something that one learned upon going to Iraq, which most Iraqis were relieved to have that regime unseated.
Let's not forget.
Yeah. Exactly, that's been forgotten. On the other side, the Orwell who hated political lying and political
propaganda.
Yeah. Exactly. So hard to say. What do you think?
And inconsistency.
Yeah.
Yes.
What do you think?
It's also hard because he never really wrote anything much about the Middle East and hadn't been there. He was very skeptical about the foundation of the State of Israel, which was the big argument going on in the closing years of his life. He wasn't very drawn by the promise of Zionism, and he was sympathetic to the Arabs of Palestine.
Do you think he believed that democracy and the freedoms that that Milton stood for could take root in non-Western countries? Is there evidence that he believed in the universality of democracy?
I'm quite sure of it. I mean, there's actually one thing, we really have only a couple of minutes, I'm sorry, but by way of illustration. Yeah. He writes to his friend, his Indian friend, Mulraj Anand, only died a couple of years ago.
Is that right?
Yeah, budding novelist then and essayist, who gets attacked in India for writing in English and using the conqueror's language, and gets mocked in England for being a sort of white Indian or too nationalist. And always says, don't worry about this, you're bound to get both those things, but I'll tell you what, I think one day there will be a department of English literature, a sort of special subset of it, written by Indians, in English. And of course now you can't go into a decent bookstore without seeing 5 or 6 brilliant Indian or Pakistani writers.
Writing in English.
Writing in English, writing better very often better than English people do.
Yeah,
I mean,
so Naipaul would have been kind of the following in the line.
Well, Naipaul's from Trinidad, but he's Indian, but I mean, I was thinking people literally from the subcontinent, Salman obviously, Hanif Qureshi, Arundhati Roy, Bikram Seth.
So certainly there's... he was not a little Englander in his view of culture and his view of expression. But one pernicious idea that's resulted from the disaster in Iraq...
George, I'm not a great master of ceremonies. This
Gotta wind
if this was a real conversation, I wouldn't be saying to you, you'll have to condense this into less than a minute.
I'll do that.
I'll give you the last word. Anyway.
Is that people who don't look like us can't do this? And that's a terrible mistake. And I don't think Orwell would have fallen into that trap of imagining that freedom is only for white people, which he
wrote an essay
writing about him too. But not when those people get him right. And I think your book, Why Orwell Matters, gets him right. You said in that book, Orwell got the 3 basic questions of the 20th century right: imperialism, fascism, and communism. And that sums up his political and literary achievement as well as any single appraisal.
I always feel they derived from each other. In other words, from what he saw about imperialism, especially the sort of sexual repression and racism that it involved, I think he found it quite easy to decode the appeal of fascism and the danger of it. It was to some extent an extension of imperialism, not purely, but to a good deal.
Yeah.
To a good deal. In many ways that was the case. And then, because it's funny, he hardly writes anything about fascism. He seems to just assume everyone will know that it's evil and needs to be fought against.
That's
There's
right.
almost nothing strange. There's almost no analysis of it. He takes it for granted that it's completely unacceptable, but it's in the course of fighting against one kind of totalitarianism that he discovers that there are many people claiming to be his allies who are not.
Yes.
And that actually there's an almost equally dangerous illusion taking place on the other side of the Urals.
I needed a kind of a model. I needed to know, how does one become a writer? And so I just read straight through what was then the only collection of Orwell's essays in journalism, the 4 volumes, collected essays, journalism, and letters, and just read straight through. It was like reading an autobiography. And
you felt yourself being personally addressed.
I felt very close to the voice of those pieces, and I think those are where you get closest to Orwell, to his voice, to what's essential, to his, really what in his character is strong and worth emulating. And I became a slavish emulator and imitator for a while in my 20s. I think it's a good way to learn how to write, just to find a writer you feel some affinity for and just master their prose style, their rhythms. You get the cadences into your own nerve system, and then try to find your own way into it, but that's the closeness Orwell produces in people like me and you, and so yeah, we feel a little bit proprietary when we read other people write. Not learn to be a novelist, I don't think. Orwell wrote a batch of novels in the 1930s that were in the tradition of Anglo-American realism, and I love them. I don't know how you feel about them, but for me, Keep the Aspidistra Flying is just a marvelous book. Burmese Days is the one that really lasts the longest, but you just don't feel that Orwell's working in his most natural grain in those novels. You feel the essayist sort of pushing through the illusion of fiction all the time. He has something to say. He has an argument to make. He has something, a proposition about the world all the time. And he doesn't have the restraint and patience of a natural fiction writer. And that's why we can be grateful that, he once wrote in, I think in Why I Write, that if he'd been left to his own devices, he would have been a kind of 19th century British novelist like his heroes Dickens and Gissing. But events and the turbulence of the 30s and 40s pushed him into becoming what he called a kind of pamphleteer. Yeah. And
by the way, I have to interrupt. Because
that's right. And he turned the same withering scrutiny on his own side that he had turned on a much easier target: Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Franco's Spain. And that was when he made most of his enemies on the left, and all the way to the end of his life. Yeah.
Now, I realize I haven't said quite enough about you. I should perhaps have said some of this at the beginning, but for those of you who don't know him already or know his work, Mr. Packer, first came to my attention actually as a novelist, writing from Africa, in fact, and like Orwell, was capable of fiction, very enviably, as well as of the long essay form by which I would think you're now probably reaching a larger audience. Mr. Packer's work, especially from Iraq and other parts of the world, but especially from Iraq, in the New Yorker, has got him a great deal of attention. And I believe you now have a collection of essays of your own.
I do. A new book out called Interesting Times, Writings from a Turbulent Decade. But back to fiction.
Yes.
You probably overpraised me there. I did write 2 novels. They were read by about 35 people. And although I learned a lot from writing them, I did not.
Welcome to C-SPAN Book TV's After Words program. My name's Christopher Hitchens, and I'm here in the, for me, unaccustomed role of interviewer and producer of my friend and colleague George Packer, who's produced 2 volumes of the essays of George Orwell, appropriately picked and introduced and commented upon. And so today, Orwell is our subject. So I wish we had more than an hour. I'm guessing that you will have read D.J. Taylor's book on George Orwell.
I haven't.
Oh, what a shame. But it doesn't matter, because what I wanted to say from his book was something that I have a feeling you'll agree with. Taylor writes at one point, says, when I read other people writing about George Orwell, I keep thinking, hey, this is my author you're talking about. Do you ever get that feeling?
I do, and we all have a, you and I and a few other people we know and some we don't know are part of a really fanatical group of Orwell lovers, and it's very personal. And I started reading Orwell maybe a little late. It was in my early 20s, but it was at a critical moment when